Hello, and welcome to Now Where Were We? A series of short videos about the history of Olympia, Lacey, and surrounding areas. Your host for this program is Deborah Ross. In this series, Deb takes us to locations that inform us about the history of our community. She also visits with local historians. We welcome your feedback and suggestions.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Now Where Were We? I'm Deborah Ross, and today I'm in Bigelow Park in northeast Olympia on a bluff overlooking Budd Inlet. The original name for this neighborhood was Ayers Hill, named after the Ayers family that settled here in the middle of the 19th century. Currently, the neighborhood is more commonly known as Bigelow Highlands, but another nickname for this neighborhood is Workingman's Hill, and that's the name that author and historian Rebecca Christie chose to name her book, Workingman's Hill. The area was settled by the middle of the 19th century, but only sparsely. It really came into its own in the first decades of the 20th century as a result of the filling of the Swantown Slough and the development of industrial processes in the Port of Olympia area. The advent of industry to the Port of Olympia area, of course, required skilled labor, and many workers were brought to this area, many of them from Scandinavia, to work in the plywood and veneer factories and other industries in the port area. The homes that were built for those workers in this neighborhood were generally smaller single-story bungalows, and that continues to be the predominant architecture of this area, although there are a few larger structures here. Because it was a distance from downtown Olympia, the neighborhood was always cohesive and to a large extent self-sufficient. There were a number of groceries here. The Roosevelt School was built in 1908 and served and continues to serve the needs of the elementary school students of this neighborhood. There were always plenty of open spaces for children to play in. This area, Bigelow Park, even before it was officially a City of Olympia park, was a great playground for the children, and older residents of the area remember playing all kinds of games in this area as they were growing up. And there are other open spaces in the area as well. One of the really important facets of life for the people who were growing up and living here was religious life. And there were a number of churches established in the Bigelow Highlands neighborhood. By and large, these were evangelical or Pentecostal churches or offshoots of the larger, more well-established denominations that congregated closer to downtown. And in a moment, we're going to take a walk down to one of those churches, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And there we're going to meet a young historian who's been doing work studying the lives of 19th and early 20th century women in Olympia, and particularly the life of Harriet Henderson, who was associated with the Pentecostal movement in Olympia. We're standing in front of the historic Seventh-day Adventist Church, which was built by architect Joseph Wolub for the Seventh-day Adventist congregation, but it has been occupied by several congregations over the years. The land for this church was donated by a woman named Harriet Henderson, and this spot is a good place to bring in Kassandra Williams, a young historian who's focusing on the history of women in late 19th and 20th century America. and in particular in the history of Olympia. So, Kassandra, one thing I've noticed in looking at maps of Olympia is that if you took a rectangle and started drawing it here on the east side, all the way down across the Swantown Slough to the port area, you'd capture a pretty wide variety of women in late 19th century and 20th century Olympia, including, of course, society woman Anne Elizabeth White Bigelow, and milliners and teachers and evangelicals like the woman we're about to talk about, Harriet Henderson. And Harriet really sort of brings together a number of those women in the form of what's known as the doorstep baby scandal. And maybe you can tell me a little bit more about Harriet and the doorstep babies.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, and she does really capture a lot of roles that women played in early 20th century Olympia. She was a teacher's wife and had a lot of children of her own, went from lifelong Methodism to Pentecostal zealotry, and ended up doing mission work down in the Tenderloin, working with women who had another somewhat typical female occupation if they were unmarried, which is sex work, which led to the doorstep baby phenomenon.
So tell me a little bit more about the doorstep babies.
So no one has said for sure that it was Harriet, but between 1899 and 1902, infants began showing up on the front porches of wealthy citizens of Olympia. And it is rumored that Mrs. Henderson had befriended sex workers in the Tenderloin as part of her religious mission and placed the children with wealthy families that she felt were good Christians and could take care of them.
So do we know anything about what happened to these babies after they were left on the doorsteps?
From what I have heard, all of them were taken in by the family of the home they were left on, and also one of them grew up to become the mayor of Olympia.
Well, then it sounds like she might have actually done these babies and the families a service.
Yeah, I would consider it a good thing. I think it's really, really bold, and it was probably pretty scary for her, and the newspaper articles from that time are pretty accusatory and interesting. But I think looking at it with our modern perspective now, we can agree that it was probably more beneficial than anything else.
So do you have anything else to add about the role of women in Olympia in the late 19th and early 20th century?
I'd say they're very brave. I'm glad that I'm a woman here now and not back then. And wow, they went through a lot of stuff. They worked really hard. They were so involved in different activist causes and different domestic tasks. And I just think it's really impressive. Really some strong, inspiring women in Olympia's history.
Yeah, one of the impressions I have is that Olympia was in some ways a real matriarchal society compared to some other towns. We had strong suffrage, strong temperance workers, and women who were in occupations that perhaps in other towns would not have been really considered available to women. Do you get that impression as well?
I do, and I think that the historical prominence of Mrs. Bigelow speaks a lot to that, and her activism and being involved in temperance and suffrage and making that happen before it happened nationwide is really impressive.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us and give us your perspective on women in 19th century and early 20th century Olympia. I really appreciate it. And good luck with your studies.
Thank you.
Thanks.